I'm 72 years old. Saying it out loud still sounds strange, as if this age doesn't suit me inside. For a long time, I thought that getting older would bring answers, but what it brought was courage. Courage to admit that the life I lived was not exactly the life I chose. For decades, I repeated to myself that everything was normal, that feeling that constant tightness in my chest was part of love. Today, I know I didn't. I know that I have been taught to confuse silence with maturity and resignation with virtue. I spent most of my life believing what I was told. I believed it when they said that the discomfort would pass, that time would adjust everything, that later I would understand. I wanted to believe, because believing was easier than facing the possibility of being stuck with a wrong choice. So I normalized the sadness, gave another name to emptiness and moved on as if it were strength. In fact, it was just survival. I didn't complain, I didn't confront, I didn't ask for more than I was given. Today I realize how much I was trained to accept. It was not something abrupt, nor evident. It was slow, almost invisible. Small concessions here, a silence there, until I became someone who no longer recognized his own desires. I learned to smile when I was expected to smile and to swallow words when they threatened to leave. The most painful thing is to know that, for a long time, I really thought that it was love. I thought that to love was to endure without asking questions. When I look back, I see a young woman who didn't have time to listen to herself. I see someone who entered a marriage too soon, not out of passion, but out of a sense of inevitability. Everyone around me seemed certain that this was the natural path, and I had no emotional vocabulary to disagree with. There were no screams, no visible chains. There were expectations, looks, repeated phrases until they became law. And I obeyed, thinking that this was what good people did. I got married believing that I would learn over time. That happiness would come later, when I was more mature, more patient, more adequate. No one asked me if I was ready. They only asked when it would be. And I went. I went with fear, I went in silence, I left parts of myself along the way. I didn't realize it at the time, but that was the beginning of a long process of internal disappearance. A process so slow that it took years to really hurt. For a long time, I avoided revisiting these memories. I told myself that dwelling on the past was no use, that the important thing was to be grateful for what I had. And I had a lot, at least in the eyes of others. A house, a family, a life considered correct. But there was something that never fit, a lingering sense of living the wrong story. I pushed that thought away and continued to fulfill my role. Now, at 72, I understand that not talking is also a form of choice. A choice I made out of fear, tiredness, not knowing that it could be different. I understand that I stayed because I was taught to stay. Because leaving was never presented as an option. It doesn't make me weak, but it saddens me deeply. I carry the grief of all the versions of me that never had a chance to exist, and that grief doesn't diminish with time. Telling this story now doesn't change what I've experienced, but it does change the way I see myself. For the first time, I don't try to justify my pain or minimize it. They existed. They mattered. And they shaped every decision that came after. If I speak today, it is because I finally stopped feeling ashamed for not having been happy. Shame that should never have been mine. Shame that was taught to me as if it were responsibility. Maybe I'm speaking too late, some would say. But the silence lasted too long. There are truths that are trapped inside us for a lifetime, waiting for the moment when they can finally breathe. This is my moment. Not to accuse, not to seek guilt, but to name what I felt. To recognize that the emotional cost of that choice was high and constant, even when no one noticed. This is not just the story of an early marriage. It is the story of a woman who learned too soon to be silent and too late to listen to herself. It is the story of what happens when we believe more in external voices than in our own. And that's why I start like this, saying my age, telling my truth. Because everything that came after was born in that first silence. The fact that you chose to stand here listening to this says a lot about who you are. What I'm going to share next isn't just my story, it's something that touches on truths that many people spend their entire lives trying to ignore. If you believe that these stories need to continue to be told, subscribe to the channel, because this space only exists with people like you. I was born in a small town, one of those where everyone knows about everyone's life before you even tell me. The streets were quiet, the houses simple, and there was a constant feeling that the world ended there. I grew up hearing that place shaped people's character, that leaving there was for a few and that questioning too much only brought problems. From an early age, I learned that belonging was more important than understanding. And belonging, in that context, meant accepting without making too much noise. My family was simple, hardworking, proud of the little they had. We never went through great needs, but there was also never room for individual desires. Everything revolved around what was considered right, proper, respectable. My father was a quiet man, rigid in customs, one of those who believed that authority cannot be explained. My mother was practical, resigned, always repeating that life was not made to be easy, but to be endured with dignity. I don't remember great demonstrations of affection. Love, there, was silent, functional, almost invisible. He showed himself in the ready-to-eat food, in the clean clothes, in the organized house. Never in deep conversations or sincere questions about what I felt. I grew up understanding that feelings were things that were resolved by themselves, preferably in silence. If something hurt, the guidance was clear: hold on, it will pass. My childhood was not marked by tragedies, and maybe that's why it took me so long to realize what I was missing. I played, studied, helped at home, followed the rules. But, inside, there was a restlessness that I couldn't name. A feeling that I needed to fit into something that was already ready before I even understood who it was. Today I see that restlessness was the beginning of my voice trying to exist. Since I was little, I learned by observing. I saw the women of the family repeating the same gestures, the same phrases, the same interrupted stories. They talked a lot about duty, little about desire. They talked about marriage as a destination, not as a choice. And I absorbed all that as absolute truth, because there was no one saying otherwise. Nobody taught me that I could want something different. At school, I was a diligent, discreet student, praised for not giving trouble. This compliment accompanied me throughout my life. Not giving work has become almost a goal. I was proud to be seen as someone who was easygoing, understanding, mature for her age. I didn't realize that this early maturity was, in fact, an adaptation. I was learning too early to mold myself. Conversations at home rarely included dreams. The future was talked about as a logical sequence: growing up, getting married, starting a family. Everything is very clear, very defined. When someone asked me what I wanted to be, the answer never really mattered. It was a question asked more out of politeness than genuine interest. And, over time, I stopped answering sincerely. There was no room for confrontation. Questioning was seen as a lack of gratitude. So I thanked him. I was grateful for the food, the house, the family, the life that they told me was good. And so, I learned to silence any discomfort even before it took shape. Silence was not imposed on me all at once. It was taught, reinforced, normalized. Today I understand that environment was not obviously cruel, but it was deeply limiting. He didn't hurt me violently, but he molded me with rigid expectations. And this left marks that I only recognized many years later. Marks that don't appear in childhood photos, but that accompanied every decision I made without realizing it. It was there, in that apparently quiet beginning, that I learned to adapt before I met myself. It was there that I began to believe that my job was to fit, not to choose. And although I didn't know it at the time, it was in that simple and silent setting that the seed of my story began to be planted. From a very early age, I understood that there were things that should not be said. Not because someone explained it clearly, but because the environment taught it. All it took was a harder look, an impatient sigh, and I knew I had gone too far. Thus, I learned to measure words before I even understood them. The silence began as caution, but gradually became a habit. And when something becomes a habit, we stop realizing that we have chosen. At home, feelings were never discussed. If I was sad, they said it was a phase. If I was confused, they said it was a lack of occupation. Any emotional discomfort was treated as exaggeration or ingratitude. So I kept it. I kept it because I wanted to be good, because I wanted to be easy, because I wanted to deserve the little affection that came in controlled doses. I learned to solve everything on my own, even when I didn't know how. My father spoke little, but his presence filled all the spaces. He didn't need to raise his voice to set limits. It was enough to exist. I grew up understanding that contradicting a man was dangerous, even when there was no explicit threat. It was an invisible danger, made up of disappointment and disapproval. My mother, in turn, always said that it was better to avoid conflict. That arguing only made things worse. And I learned this lesson well. At school, I watched other children question, complain, cry loudly. I didn't do any of that. Not because I didn't feel it, but because I already knew it was no use. Being silent earned me compliments, and those compliments gave me a sense of worth. I confused acceptance with love. And the more I kept quiet, the more I felt safe in that role they had created for me. There were times when something inside me tried to escape. A sudden urge to say no, to ask why, to express displeasure. But this desire was accompanied by immediate guilt. I felt wrong before I even spoke. Then he took a deep breath, swallowed the impulse and followed. Gradually, I got very good at it. So good that even I myself believed I had nothing to say. The women around me reinforced this behavior without realizing it. They said that I was mature, that I had a clear head, that I was different from the others. I smiled, proudly, not understanding that compliment came at the expense of my spontaneity. Being different, in that context, meant being restrained. And I tried very hard to continue to be. Over time, I began to feel a distance between what I was on the inside and what I showed on the outside. But I didn't know how to explain it to anyone, not even myself. Words were lacking. Permission was lacking. I even lacked the understanding that I had the right to this type of conflict. So I kept going, fulfilling expectations, believing that this was how life worked. silence became a protection. He spared me conflicts, arguments, disappointing those I loved. At least that's what I thought. I didn't realize that by protecting myself from others, I was moving away from myself. Each time I failed to say something important, something inside me shrank a little more. Today I can see clearly. It was not a conscious choice. It was a training. A slow, daily learning, reinforced by small emotional rewards. I wasn't forced to be silent. I was convinced that talking wasn't worth it. And this belief accompanied me for many years, shaping decisions that I thought were natural. That's how silence stopped being just the absence of sound and became part of my identity. I was the one who didn't complain, the one who understood, the one who adapted. And while everyone saw this as a quality, I gradually lost the ability to listen to myself. Without realizing it, I was being prepared to accept much more than I should. As I grew older, expectations became clearer, even when no one said them directly. I observed, learned, and adjusted. I knew how to behave, what to avoid, when to smile and when to be quiet. All of this felt natural, as if it were written in some invisible place that everyone read but me. No one needed to explain what my role was, because it was already defined before I even asked. They expected me to be kind, understanding, discreet. That didn't create problems, that didn't attract attention. They expected me to understand the tiredness of others before I even recognized mine. And I understood. I understood so much that I always put myself in the background without realizing it. I thought it was beautiful to be the one who gave in, the one who facilitated, the one who didn't demand anything more than what was necessary to stay there. Over time, I began to realize that there was a clear difference between what was expected of me and what was allowed of others. Men could make mistakes, get angry, raise their voices. Women needed to be patient, calm, organized. If something was not going well, the responsibility always seemed to fall on us. I absorbed it in silence, thinking that it was like this everywhere, that there was no alternative. When I expressed any doubts about the future, ready-made answers soon emerged. They said that I thought too much, that I needed to trust in the natural way of things. That happiness came with stability, and stability came with right choices. These choices, curiously, were never really mine. They were approved, expected, encouraged choices. And I confused approval with security. I began to feel that there was little room for who I really was. My tastes, my desires, my dreams always seemed secondary, almost irrelevant. Not because anyone openly forbade them, but because no one asked about them. And when they don't ask, we learn to think it doesn't matter. Thus, I lowered my own expectations until they fit what was expected of me. There was a silent script being followed. I just needed to stay out of line. Growing up right, getting married at the right time, forming a respectable family. This script was presented as protection, as a guarantee of a smooth life. And I, who was afraid of making mistakes, clung to him tightly. Following rules seemed safer than facing the unknown. Sometimes, I wondered what my life would be like if I had been born different, in another place, in another family. But these thoughts came loaded with guilt. It was as if imagining something different was a betrayal of everything they gave me. So I would push those questions away and focus on being grateful. Gratitude became a way to shut me up. The compliment came whenever I fulfilled what was expected. They said I was a good daughter, a good girl, someone trustworthy. I smiled, feeling a strange mixture of pride and emptiness. Proud to be doing everything right. Empty because I didn't know exactly what it meant to me. But I didn't have the emotional vocabulary to question it. I just knew how to follow. Today I understand that these expectations were not only external. Over time, they became mine. I started to demand from myself what the world demanded. I started to watch myself, to correct myself, to restrain myself. And when the moment of the big decision came, I was already completely prepared to accept. Prepared to fulfill what was expected of me, even if it cost important parts of who I was. There was no direct request, nor a solemn announcement. There was only one moment when I began to hear the same phrase over and over again, spoken by different voices, in varying tones, but with the same meaning. They said it was time. Time to think about the future, time to take life seriously, time to do what was expected. I was still very young, but no one seemed to find it relevant. Youth, in that context, was not something to be lived, but quickly overcome. Marriage emerged as a natural, almost inevitable affair. They talked about it as if it were an automatic step, something that simply happened when everything was done right. They didn't ask me if I wanted to, they asked when. And this difference, so subtle, changed everything. I felt pushed by a silent current, not knowing exactly where I was going, just trusting that everyone around me knew more than I did. I remember the constant feeling of doubt mixed with guilt. Doubt because I didn't feel sure they said was normal. Guilt for thinking there was something wrong with me for not being happy. They said I was nervous, that I thought too much, that I needed to trust. And I trusted it. I trusted because questioning seemed dangerous, and trusting was what was expected of me. So I was silencing my own questions. Conversations took place around me, rarely with me. Decisions were made in a tone of advice, but they sounded like soft orders. No one raised their voices, no one threatened me. Still, I felt that saying no was not a real option. The no existed only in theory, not in practice. And I, who have always learned to avoid conflict, gave in without realizing it. There were phrases that were repeated and kept echoing inside me. That after the wedding everything would make sense. That love was built over time. That every woman was afraid of in the beginning. These words followed me like an invisible manual, trying to explain a feeling I couldn't fit in. Instead of listening to my discomfort, I listened to these voices, believing they knew better. Deep down, I hoped that someone would notice my silence and ask if I was okay. I was hoping that someone would give me a way out, even if it was a small one. But no one asked. And I didn't know how to ask. I was confusing acceptance with maturity, obedience with responsibility. Every step I took seemed to take me a little further away from myself, but I was still unaware of it. The day when everything was decided was nothing special. There were no tears, no intense joy. There was an implicit agreement, a collective relief, as if I was finally on the right track. Everyone seemed satisfied, except me. But I didn't trust my feelings enough to take them seriously. So I smiled, nodded, and moved on. Today, looking back, I see clearly how decisive that moment was. Not because someone forced me, but because I was led to believe that there was no choice. And when we believe that, we stop fighting before we even try. That was the beginning of a life built more by the expectations of others than by my own will. I didn't go into that marriage believing I was making a mistake. I went in believing that I was doing what needed to be done. And perhaps this was the biggest mistake of all. Because when we do something just because it's time, without listening to what we feel, we start to move dangerously away from who we are. And this distancing, I would learn later, takes a high and silent toll. The wedding happened too quickly for me to understand what I was feeling. Everything was organized efficiently, as if it were just another task to be accomplished. There were people smiling, comments about how beautiful I looked, compliments on the right decision. I felt out of place within my own life, observing everything from the outside, like someone who watches a scene that has already been rehearsed. I don't remember feeling real joy, just a constant nervousness that no one seemed to notice. While everyone celebrated, I tried to convince myself that this discomfort was normal. They said that it was like that in the beginning, that fear was part of it, that love would come with time. I repeated these phrases inside my head like a mantra, trying to silence the inner voice that insisted on saying that something wasn't right. That voice was weak, insecure, and I had already learned not to trust it. My husband was not cruel. This is an important truth. He was correct, reserved, accustomed to being obeyed without having to ask. He never raised his hand, never screamed. But there was a constant distance, a lack of listening that I didn't know how to cross. I felt small around him, as if my emotions were too exaggerated for that space. So I started adjusting them, making them smaller, until they almost disappeared. For the first few months, I struggled to do everything the right way. I observed other women, copied behaviors, tried to guess what was expected of me. I didn't want to make mistakes, I didn't want to disappoint. Every little internal conflict was treated as a personal failure. If I felt sad, I thought it was a lack of gratitude. If I felt trapped, I thought it was immaturity. There was always an explanation that put me in charge. Over time, I stopped waiting for someone to notice my silence. I understood that it was convenient for everyone. I didn't complain, I didn't demand, I didn't create problems. This gave me apparent peace, but it cost me whole nights awake, thinking about what had happened to that young woman who dreamed without knowing exactly what. She was still there, but more and more distant. I didn't go into that marriage believing I was giving up on myself. I believed that I was just putting off some things, doing what needed to be done first. I thought that later there would be room for me. After organizing the house, after fulfilling responsibilities, after maturing. This after became an imaginary place where I put everything I felt, waiting for the right moment to search. Accepting was easier than choosing. Choosing would require confrontation, explanations, courage that I had not learned to develop. Accepting allowed me to move forward without arousing suspicion, without causing disappointment. And so, day after day, I was living a life that seemed right on the outside and increasingly empty on the inside. But I still didn't call it empty. I called it adaptation. Today I know that acceptance was not passive due to lack of will, but due to lack of emotional alternative. I didn't know I could want more. I didn't know I could say no. I just did what I learned to do best, stay. And this staying, silent and constant, shaped the years that came after in a way that I would only be able to understand much later. Marriage didn't take everything away from me at once. He gradually took it off, in small concessions that seemed harmless. When I realized, I no longer knew where the expectations of others ended and where mine began. Maybe they never really started. And this is a difficult realization to carry, even now, so many years later. It didn't take long for sadness to start seeping into my daily life, but it didn't come abruptly. She came discreetly, almost politely, like someone who excuses herself before entering. It was a constant sense of tightness, a nameless melancholy that I carried as I went about my tasks. I woke up, followed the routine, did everything that was expected of me. On the outside, nothing seemed wrong. Inside, something was always out of place. At first, I thought it was tiredness. Then, I thought it was a lack of adaptation. They said that every beginning was difficult, that it was a matter of time before everything was settled. I really wanted to believe that, because to admit otherwise would mean facing a truth I wasn't prepared for. So I started to justify every bad feeling, to explain to myself that it was part of adult life, that no one was happy all the time. Over the years, that sadness ceased to cause strangeness. It has become part of the landscape, like an old piece of furniture that has always been there. I learned to live with it, to ignore it when possible, to carry it when necessary. She no longer cried easily, but she also did not feel true joy. I lived in an in-between, neutral state, where nothing hurt too much, but nothing really fulfilled. When I rarely tried to talk about what I felt, the answers came ready. They said that I had a good life, that I had no reason to feel that way. These phrases made me doubt myself even more. If everything seemed right to others, then the problem could only be with me. And so, sadness gained a new name, guilt. Guilt for not being happy, for not thanking enough, for wanting something I didn't even know how to explain. I started to observe other women and wonder if they also felt this way. Many seemed resigned, tired, but rarely spoke. It was as if there was a silent agreement not to name the discomfort. And I entered into this agreement without realizing it. I learned to smile when they asked if everything was okay. I learned to answer yes before I even thought about the question. Gradually, I moved away from myself. My desires became more distant, my dreams more vague. I could no longer say what I wanted for myself, only what needed to be done. Life has become a sequence of obligations fulfilled correctly, with no room for reflection. And the less I reflected, the easier it became to follow. At least that's what I told myself. The most dangerous thing of all was to realize that I was no longer surprised by that state. Constant sadness did not scream, did not beg for attention. She just existed, silent, accompanying my days. And when something lasts too long, we start to believe that it is normal. I really believed it. I believed that living like this was the price of stability, maturity, and adulthood. Today I understand that that was one of the most delicate moments of my career. Not because something visible happened, but because something essential was being erased. I stopped listening to myself. I stopped trusting my discomfort. I turned pain into routine, emptiness into habit. And that kept me stuck for much longer than any external obligation. Learning to call sadness normal was an adaptation, a survival strategy. But every strategy has a cost. Mine was to spend years without realizing that it didn't have to be this way. That I wasn't wrong for feeling that way. This understanding, unfortunately, would only come much later, when time had already taken with it many possibilities. The years began to pass without me realizing when exactly I stopped counting time. One day seemed the same as the next, and this repetition brought a false sense of security. I followed my routine, took care of the house, met the family's needs, did everything correctly. People around me saw stability, responsibility, commitment. I saw only continuity. There were no major conflicts, but there was no room for me either. Marriage became a habit. We talked about what was necessary, solved practical issues, shared the same space without really meeting. I got used to not waiting too long, because waiting hurt. I adjusted my expectations until they fit the reality I had. And the smaller they got, the less I felt frustration. At least that's what I believed. In fact, I was just numbing important parts of myself. The children came, and with them a new layer of meaning to continue. I dedicated myself deeply, putting into them everything I no longer knew how to put into myself. Caring has become my main function, my justification, my identity. I told myself that now it didn't matter what I felt anymore, because there were bigger responsibilities. And this idea was accepted without resistance, like everything else in my life. Guilt started to accompany me constantly. Guilt for thinking of me when there was so much to be done. Guilt for feeling tired when everyone said I was strong. Guilt for not being fully happy in a life that seemed right. I rarely talked about it, because I didn't want to sound ungrateful. I learned to keep even what hurt me the deepest. There were moments of emotional confusion that I couldn't explain. I felt distant, disconnected, as if I was always fulfilling a role. Sometimes, I found myself staring out the window for too long, without thinking about anything specific. It was just a silent pause, an interval where I could exist without function. These moments were rare, but necessary to continue. My body began to show subtle signs of tiredness. It was nothing that could be easily pointed out, just persistent fatigue, a constant weight. I attributed it to the time, the routine, the life that everyone led. I never considered that it could be connected to what I felt. I separated body and emotion as if they were different things, because that was how I had learned. People used to say that I was strong, that I could handle everything. This comment always came as a compliment, but inside me it sounded like a sentence. Being strong meant not falling, not complaining, not asking for help. And I kept being strong, even when it cost me more than I had to give. The force has become a silent prison. Over the years, I became more and more discreet within my own life. My opinions became shorter, my desires more timid. I avoided conflict so skillfully that sometimes I didn't even realize when I was giving up something important. All in the name of peace, harmony, the maintenance of a structure that I believed I could not shake. Today I understand that prolonged silence was not empty. It was full of unsaid things, accumulated feelings, swallowed questions. Each year that passed without me listening to myself made it more difficult to recognize my own voice. Still, I kept going, believing I was doing the right thing, not imagining that the price of it would reveal itself later. The years passed too quickly. When I realized it, I was long gone. And I was still there, in the same emotional place, sustaining a lifetime without ever having stopped to ask if that was really where I wanted to be. This question, which I had avoided for so long, began to slowly form within me, waiting for the right moment to emerge. At some point, guilt stopped being an occasional feeling and became part of who I was. I felt guilty about things I couldn't explain properly. Guilty for not being satisfied, for not feeling the happiness that they said was natural. Guilty for thinking that my life could have been different. This guilt was not accompanied by external accusation. It was born inside me, fueled by years of silence and comparison. The emotional confusion was constant. I didn't know how to distinguish what was sadness, what was tiredness, what was simple conformism. Everything was mixed in a continuous state of contained discouragement. I kept working, solving problems, taking care of everyone, but without clarity about myself. The less I understood what I felt, the easier it was to believe that there was nothing wrong, just something poorly explained inside me. Shame started to show when I compared myself to other people. I looked outside and saw stories that seemed lighter, more alive. I wondered why I couldn't feel the same. That comparison was never fair, but I didn't know it. I thought there was something defective in me, some inability to enjoy what I had. And this idea silenced me even more. I rarely talked about it with anyone. At most, he made vague comments, which were soon discarded with ready-made phrases. They said it was a phase, that it would pass, that I needed to think positive. I agreed, because disagreeing would require an explanation that I didn't have. How to explain a void that had no name, no apparent cause? So I swallowed it and followed, as I always did. The deepest shame came from the feeling of ingratitude. I had a family, a house, healthy children. How dare I feel this way? This question was with me constantly. I believed that acknowledging my pain meant devaluing everything I had built. And since I didn't want to destroy anything, I chose to destroy parts of myself in silence. There were days when I felt completely disconnected, like I was living someone else's life. I fulfilled tasks automatically, without real presence. This distancing scared me, but I pretended not to notice. It was easier to follow the automatic than to stop and face what was behind that sensation. To stop would mean to feel, and to feel seemed dangerous. Over time, I learned to hide these conflicts well. I developed an appearance of tranquility that deceived even myself. People saw me as someone balanced, centered, reliable. I saw someone tired of sustaining this image. But I didn't know how to let go of it. She was already part of my identity. The emotional confusion turned into a constant background noise. It wasn't loud enough to cause alarm, but it never completely silenced. I lived like this, with this persistent sense of inadequacy, believing that it was the price to pay for a stable life. It never occurred to me that stability without truth can also make you sick. Today I realize that guilt was not a sign of personal error. It was a sign that something essential was being denied. But at that time, I didn't have that clarity. I just kept going, carrying shame, confusion and silence, believing that one day everything would make sense. That day took much longer than I imagined. At some point, my body started to say what I didn't say. It wasn't all at once, nor dramatically. It was subtle, persistent, like a constant warning that I insisted on ignoring. A tiredness that did not go away with rest, a lack of energy that did not match the organized life I led. I woke up already tired, as if I hadn't really slept, even after a whole night in bed. The nights, by the way, became difficult. I would lie down and the silence would bring thoughts that I spent the whole day avoiding. The mind did not turn off. He relived conversations, decisions, moments that seemed small, but carried a strange weight. Often, I got up before dawn, not out of willingness, but because of an inability to stay there, facing everything that came to the surface when the world slept. I began to feel pain that had no clear explanation. A tightness in my chest, a constant tension in my shoulders, a feeling of heaviness that I carried without knowing where it came from. I was looking for practical reasons for all this. He attributed it to age, work, accumulated responsibilities. I never considered that it could have anything to do with what I felt and never expressed. Emotion and body, for me, were still separate things. People around me noticed my tiredness, but always in a superficial way. They said I needed to rest more, take some time for myself. I agreed, but I didn't know how to do it for real. Resting the body seemed possible. Resting the mind, no. Because the mind was stuck in a lifetime of silences, and there was not enough pause for that. Even so, I continued. I always continued. I slowed down when I could, but I never stopped. Not because I didn't need to, but because I didn't know how. To stop would mean listening, and listening would mean to admit things that I did not yet have the courage to name. So I kept pushing, believing that wear and tear was part of adult life, especially the life of a woman who always put others first. There were days when I felt strangely distant from my own body. As if he was only there to fulfill functions, while I watched from afar. This disconnection scared me, but I didn't talk about it. She didn't want to appear weak, nor exaggerated. I had already learned that my sensations were rarely taken seriously, so I learned not to take them to anyone. Over time, the body became just another thing to be managed. I took care of him as I took care of the house, the chores, the obligations. I did what was necessary to keep it working. But there was no listening, only maintenance. I didn't ask him what he needed, I just forced him to keep following a life that never stopped to breathe. Today I can clearly see that fatigue was not just physical. It was the weight of years of living disconnected from myself. It was the accumulated cost of every word swallowed, every feeling ignored. My body carried what my voice never said. And he found his own way of speaking, even when I didn't want to listen. At the time, however, I did not make that connection. I continued to believe that this was normal, that everyone felt this way at some point. I didn't know that wear and tear was a clear sign that something needed to change. I just followed, as I always did, waiting for time to settle. Little did I know that time was just accumulating everything I avoided. That's how my body became a silent mirror of my story. A mirror that I avoided looking at for a long time. It wasn't until years later, when the truth began to emerge, that I understood that he was never against me. He just tried, in any way he could, to tell the story that I spent my whole life trying to silence. The question came from where I least expected it, in a seemingly ordinary moment, without any preparation. There was no solemn atmosphere, no deep intention. It was said naturally, almost as a curiosity. Still, when I heard those words, I felt something inside me move. Were you happy? The simplicity of the question contrasted with the impact it made. My body reacted before my mind, as if something had been touched after decades of dormancy. For a few seconds, I couldn't answer. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I had never allowed myself to formulate it. My first reaction was to smile, as I always did. The automatic, trained smile that came before any reflection. But this time he didn't hold up. I felt my throat tighten, my eyes burn, and a strange silence settle between us. A different, heavy, revealing silence. At that moment, I realized how much that question had never been asked. No one ever cared if I was happy. They wanted to know if I was okay, if everything was okay, if I needed something practical. Happiness seemed like an irrelevant detail, something that was assumed, not something that was investigated. And I had never asked myself that honestly either. The question echoed within me long after the moment had passed. I spent days thinking about her. It would come up while I was doing the dishes, while walking around the house, while trying to sleep. Were you happy? It wasn't, it's happy. It was. That confronted me with a whole life, not just the present. And the more I thought, the harder it became to ignore what came up. The memories came disordered, mixed with feelings that I had always avoided. I began to revisit moments that I had filed as normal. Situations that I accepted without question, choices that I made without realizing that I was choosing. For the first time, I looked at these memories without trying to justify them. I just watched. And what I saw was not a sequence of mistakes, but a sequence of silences. Silences that accumulated until they became a lifetime. That question opened a rift. It wasn't comfortable. It brought pain, confusion, a sense of loss that was difficult to explain. But it also brought something new, clarity. For the first time, I considered the possibility that my discomfort was neither exaggeration nor weakness. That maybe there was a legitimate reason for everything I've felt over the years. This idea, while frightening, was also deeply liberating. I didn't answer the question that day. He said something vague, something that revealed nothing. But inside, something had already changed. I could no longer pretend that I had never thought about it. The question had planted a seed, and it began to grow too fast to ignore. It was as if, after so many years, someone had finally turned on the light in a room that I had avoided entering. I started to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. The way I always put myself in the background, how much I minimized my own needs, how much I normalized the discomfort. All of this began to gain clearer contours. And with that clarity came a deep sadness, but also a strange sense of relief. As if, finally, I was seeing the truth. This question didn't change my past, but it did change my relationship with it. She forced me to face what I had spent my whole life avoiding. And even though it was painful, it was necessary. Because from that moment on, I could no longer say that I didn't know. Ignorance, which had protected me for so long, was no longer an option. That's how everything started to transform. Not with a big event, not with a dramatic revelation, but with a simple question, said without intention to hurt, which ended up opening up everything that I kept closed for years. A question that made me understand that the silence I carried was not natural. It was learned. And, for the first time, I began to unlearn him. That part that comes now is the hardest to say out loud. To tell it, I need to let go of the last silence that has protected me for decades, and that comes at an emotional cost that still hurts. If you've come this far with me, it's because you understand that some truths hurt more when they are hidden. So I ask you, sign up, not as support, but as an act of preservation, so that voices like mine don't disappear when they finally decide to speak out. After that question, something inside me could not return to the place it was before. I tried to follow the routine, pretend that nothing had changed, but it was useless. The truth, once touched, no longer accepts being ignored. I began to realize how much I had spent my entire life avoiding looking at myself honestly. Not out of cowardice, but because I really didn't know I could do it. Gradually, I came to understand that I was not weak, nor exaggerated, nor ungrateful. Those words were never mine. They were labels that I accepted because I had no others to explain what I felt. The truth was simpler and harder. I was silenced. I was taught to believe that my doubts didn't matter, that my feelings were inconvenient, that my job was to adapt. This realization did not come as an immediate relief. It was accompanied by pain, a silent mourning for everything that could have been different. I mourned the young woman who entered a marriage not knowing she could choose. I grieved the woman who spent years believing the problem was with her. Each memory took on a new meaning, and that hurt more than just continuing to pretend that everything was fine. I started to revisit my story with different eyes. Situations that I always minimized began to show themselves for what they really were. There was no explicit cruelty, but there was control. There was no screaming, but there was constant devaluation. There was no visible violence, but there was a continual pressure for me to be smaller, quieter, more convenient. And this also leaves marks. The hardest thing was to accept that I participated in this process. Not by free choice, but by survival. I kept quiet because it seemed like the only way to maintain some stability. Acknowledging this was important, because it allowed me to stop blaming myself. I did the best I could with the tools I had. And that doesn't erase the pain, but it gives back a little dignity to my story. There were times when anger appeared, albeit in a contained way. Anger at missed opportunities, unasked questions, unpresented choices. But this anger did not find a clear target. She didn't want revenge, she wanted recognition. I just wanted someone to say, "You were right to feel this way." And for the first time, I was the one who said it. Accepting this truth changed the way I saw myself. I stopped seeing myself as someone who failed to be happy and started to see myself as someone who was molded to annul herself. This change in perspective was profound. It didn't solve everything, but it made room for a kinder understanding of myself. An understanding that I had never allowed myself. I realized that avoiding the truth kept me functioning for a long time, but it also kept me stuck. Looking at it now, even late, has given me something I've never had: clarity. Clarity about what happened to me and what I lost trying to be what was expected of me. This clarity did not come to punish me, but to set me free. Today I know that that question did not awaken something new. It just revealed what had always been there, waiting for permission to exist. The truth I avoided was not destructive. It was destructive to ignore it for so long. And, even with so many years past, facing her was one of the most honest acts I've ever done with myself. When the truth finally settled in me, there were no explosions or dramatic confrontations. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't demand explanations, I didn't rewrite the past in search of culprits. What happened was a different silence, heavy, but clear. A silence of understanding. For the first time, I understood that many things didn't happen because I didn't know I could want differently. And this realization changed everything inside me. I started to look at my history without the automatic impulse to defend or justify myself. I no longer had to say that it wasn't so bad or that it could have been worse. These phrases, which I repeated for years, have lost their function. They were only to keep me quiet. As I put them aside, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for what I lost. Relief to finally see clearly. I didn't feel like confronting anyone. Not because all was forgiven, but because I understood that many were also stuck in roles they had learned to play. This does not erase what I experienced, but it helped me to stop carrying an anger that would not take me anywhere. My confrontation needed to be with myself, with the truths I hid to keep functioning. Accepting that I stayed because I was trained to stay was one of the hardest steps. For a long time, I thought it diminished me. Today I understand that, in fact, it explains. I did what was possible within the limitations that were imposed on me, internal and external. Acknowledging this does not change the past, but it does change the way I stand in front of it. There was a moment when I realized that I didn't need to punish myself anymore. I spent years believing that I failed because I wasn't happy, when in fact I just survived the way I learned. This change of view was profound. It did not bring immediate joy, but it did bring peace. A quiet peace, without euphoria, but solid enough to sustain me. With this awareness, I began to allow myself small gestures of honesty. To say that something bothered me, recognize when I was tired, admitting, at least to myself, that some choices cost me dearly. These gestures may seem simple, but for me they were revolutionary. It was like learning a new language after a lifetime of silence. I also realized that I didn't need to rewrite my story to validate it. It was already real, with all its nuances, pains, and ambiguities. I didn't have to turn it into something too heroic or tragic. It was enough to accept it as it was. This acceptance did not mean conformism, but respect for everything I lived and felt. Throughout this process, something inside me rose again. She was not the young woman I once was, nor the woman I could have been. It was who I am now, with consciousness, memory, and a voice that, although late, finally exists. And that, in itself, was already a form of reparation. I understood that not all liberation comes with rupture. Some come with understanding. Mine came like this, without screaming, without drama, without spectacle. It came with a deep understanding that I no longer had to pretend that everything was fine. I could just acknowledge what was and move on with more truth. It was at this point that I realized that, even late, something had changed definitively. I was no longer bound by the silence that had accompanied me for decades. He still existed, but he no longer controlled me. For the first time, I was at peace to know who I was, who I am, and to finally allow these two versions to talk. Coming to this conclusion was like going through a silent mourning. Not the mourning for someone who died, but for someone who never had the chance to exist. When I realized that I survived for many years without actually living, I felt a weight that was difficult to explain. It was not simple repentance, nor revolt. It was the belated awareness that my life was built more on resistance than on desire. I spent a lot of time confusing survival with strength. He thought that moving forward, despite everything, was a sign of maturity. Today I see that it was, above all, adaptation. I adapted so well that I almost disappeared within this ability to endure. I fulfilled roles, maintained structures, sustained relationships. But I rarely wondered if it really nourished me. Living, I discovered late, requires presence. It requires internal listening, conscious choices, even mistakes of one's own. I lived a correct life, but little questioned. I did what needed to be done, not what needed to be felt. And this created a functional existence, but empty in many ways. Not empty of events, but of personal meaning. The most painful thing was to understand that no one stole this life from me directly. It was gradually ceded, in the name of peace, acceptance, stability. Each concession seemed too small to be challenged. And when I realized it, the set of them had formed a whole story. A story where I was physically present, but absent from myself. There were good moments, yes. I don't deny that. Laughter, achievements, moments of tenderness. But even these moments were crossed by an eerie sense of distance, as if something was always missing. Now I know that what was missing was me. My voice, my desire, my conscious choice to be there. Recognizing this did not cancel everything I experienced, but it changed the weight of the memories. I started to look at my trajectory with more honesty and less self-punishment. I did what I could within the conditions given to me. This does not erase the loss, but it makes it understandable. And understanding is a kind of care that I never had for myself. I also understood that surviving is not little. There is merit in continuing when there is no way out. There is strength in sustaining when one is unprepared to break through. But surviving shouldn't be the ultimate goal of a lifetime. And this perception, even late, brought me a clarity that I had never experienced. Today, when I think of the past, I do not wish to go back in time. I just wish that someone had told me that I could want more, that I could choose, that I could say no. As this did not happen, I choose to say now. To say it to myself, first of all. Recognize that my story was not weak, but it was limited. And limits also hurt. I survived for many years because it was what I knew how to do. But now, even in the time I have left, I choose to live with more truth. Maybe I can't change everything, but I can change the way I listen to myself. And that, to me, is the most important difference between just surviving and finally starting to live. If I have come this far, telling all this, it was not to rewrite my life or to look for late culprits. It was because I understood that the silence that accompanied me for so many years did not need to accompany me to the end. Speaking now is a way of existing in a way that I have never been able to before. It's the first time I've put my story at the center, without apologizing for it. I learned that many choices that seem natural only seem that way because no one shows us alternatives. I am not an exception, I am a consequence. Consequence of a time, of a culture, of expectations that are imposed without raising their voices. For years, I believed that discomfort was my fault, when in fact it was a clear sign that something was not aligned with who I was. Today I know that being silent is also a decision. A decision that, in my case, was taught, reinforced and normalized. I stayed because I learned to stay. Because no one told me I could go. Because I was told that to endure was a virtue and to question was weakness. These ideas shaped my life in profound ways, even when I wasn't aware of it. If there is something I want to leave as a lesson, it is this: listen to what bothers you, even if no one validates it. The discomfort does not arise for nothing. He tries to warn, protect, guide. Ignoring it for too long has a high, silent, accumulated cost. I paid this price little by little, without realizing it, until it revealed itself in the form of absence. Don't wait decades to ask yourself if you're happy. Don't normalize what hurts just because it seems ordinary. Don't accept the idea that wanting more is ingratitude. There is a huge difference between being grateful and canceling yourself. I confused these two things for a long time, and this confusion shaped my entire trajectory. Perhaps you who are listening to my story recognize yourself in parts of it. Perhaps you feel that familiar squeeze, that doubt that insists on coming back. If so, don't ignore it. Don't convince yourself that it's an exaggeration. Don't wait for someone to give you permission to listen to yourself. This permission needs to come from within. I can't go back in time. I can't live the life I didn't live. But I can now name my story and respect everything I felt. I can stop pretending that everything was as it should have been. And that, in itself, is already a form of reparation. A belated, but necessary, form of justice with myself. If there's one thing I've learned at age 72, it's that some truths wait a lifetime to be told. They do not disappear. They just wait for courage. And even when they arrive late, they still matter. They still liberate. They still transform. That's my truth. And perhaps, when you listen to it, you will find the courage not to silence yours. If this story touched something in you, share this video. It's not just about what I've experienced, but about patterns that continue to shape lives in silence. By sharing, you can get those words to reach someone who still believes they need to shut up, and that, in itself, is an act of transformation. I'll stay here reading every comment. Tell me, from which city or country are you watching and what about this story stayed with you? Your words really matter to me, they don't sit in a vacuum.